Well, I think we shall get started. I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm executive director of the YIVO Institute, and it's a wonderful pleasure to invite Marci Shore here and to have her come and talk about her new book. I knew Marci first when I was at Yale University Press and had the privilege of publishing Caviar and Ashes, her first book on interwar Polish-Jewish intelligentsia. And her new book is The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, which is published by Crown this year. It is so new that we don't even have a copy of it. But it has been wonderfully reviewed, and it's really a privilege to have Marci come and talk about it. Marci Shore is Associate Professor of History at Yale University. She is a translator, she is multilingual, polyglot, she is one of those scholars. There it is. Here, very good, very good. She is one of those scholars that all younger scholars wish they could be, and older scholars wish they had been.
Well, thank you to Jonathan, and thank you to YIVO. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out. Okay, that's going to fall off. Thank you for coming out on a not very sunny Thursday afternoon. Let me see. Not quite so tall. All right. So the book I wrote is called The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. In 1848, when Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto, it begins with the line, "A specter is haunting Europe," the specter of communism. I love this line because, among other things, it's the moment at which Marx, the militant materialist, confesses to his own metaphysical moment, in that first line of the manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, a specter of communism. And when Marx and Engels wrote that in 1848, communism was a specter to come, a specter from the future. Well, now, 150-some years later, communism, I would argue, is no less haunting as a specter from the past. So this book, the subtitle is The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. It is literally about totalitarianism's afterlife. This is not a book about post-communist nostalgia. It's rather a book about the darker side of the fall of communism, about the darkness that lingered. It's about the way in which the totalitarian past continues to linger in the present, and it's about the impossibility of closure, the impossibility of making the past okay. So let me begin vaguely autobiographically, and that's to say that I first went to Eastern Europe in the early 1990s wanting to experience a kind of happy ending, because it seemed that the Wicked Witch was dead, and the people were liberated, and censorship was lifted, and the archives would be open, and then we would all bask in the light of truth. Well, now, some 20-some years later, as a historian who has spent a lot of time in those archives that have opened, now I know that, in fact, one does not bask in the light of truth and live happily ever after. That, on the contrary, there would be no basking in the light of truth. And that would be for a reason that I will explain to you via a return to Marx and Freud. So as you might remember, the great battle between Marx and Freud a century or so ago, in which Marx promises us happily ever after and Freud promises us no such thing. Well, it turns out that Freud was right. And for Freud, the unconscious was a kind of dark psychic closet into which everything too disturbing for the conscious mind was thrown. And Freud had no illusions that when you start coaxing the contents of that dark psychic closet into consciousness, he had no illusions that that was going to be nice, that that was going to be pleasant. Well, For decades, the communist archives had played the role of the Freudian unconscious. They were that dark psychic closet into which everything too disturbing for the conscious mind was thrown. And so the idea then that you throw open the doors of those archives and you bask in the light of truth, in fact, was a misunderstanding, because what Freud understood and Marx didn't was that, in fact, what is repressed will return to haunt us. So this is a book, and I'll tell you very briefly kind of what the book is about overall, and then I'll tell you a bit more specifically about some of its moments, in particular those that concern Poles, Jews, and communism. It's a book about former communists and former dissidents. It's a book about people who stayed and people who left. It's a book about Poles and Jews, and to a large extent about Poles and Jews. It's a book about the presence of the past, the impossibility of closure, and the omnipresence of guilt. And it's a book about the human dimension of the fall of communism and accounting with the past. So while the book is in principle about post-communist Eastern Europe, it's mostly focused on former Czechoslovakia and Poland. It goes a bit into Romania, into Ukraine and Russia, for the highly contingent reason that these were the places where I spent time, and these are the places that I know. It's written in the first person. It's not, strictly speaking, a scholarly book, although there's much archival material in it. It's a memoir of sorts, with the caveat that I'm a very minor character. It's a memoir of sorts with the caveat that it's not about myself. It's a book that I wrote alongside the first book that I published. When I began somehow collecting the material or filing the material that I was collecting for one book that I began to understand was too personal to go into that book. It's, in particular, a book that I began as I started talking to the children and the grandchildren of the characters who were the protagonist in my first book. And coming across all of these cases where people betray people who saved them and forgive people who betrayed them, where people make choices that often seem inexplicable and yet are explicable at certain extreme historical moments. It's a book that relies on what I would call a kind of irreducible anecdote, this kind of anecdotal moment of human encounter that I found could not go into a scholarly book because it could not be proven to have consistent application, and yet seemed to me was in some fundamental way revelatory of some essential existential dynamic. It's a book about a kind of Pandora's box, about the spilling out of the contents of that Pandora's box after 1989, about 1989 as a radical rupture in time, a moment at which time that had been seemingly halted for so long suddenly becomes expedited and suddenly starts moving faster and faster. And it's a book in which time kind of goes in both ways, because on one hand, the book begins in 1989 and kind of moves forward through the first two communist decades, but at the same time, it continually goes back through time as I am interrogating in various ways the past. And 1989 is the pivot. Is the pivot of both of those narratives, both the forward-moving narrative and the backward-moving narrative. People have to, one of the things that happens after 1989 that struck me so powerfully from the beginning was that people have to account for the choices they made in a world in which all the rules have changed. All the rules have radically changed. So this is about settling of accounts, what it means to try to settle those accounts. And it is secondarily a book about what Roman Jakobson and the Russians like to call the obnaženia, the kind of the laying bare, the laying bare of history, that exposes in some ways or casts a light onto the dilemmas of the historical process. And that is a kind of sub-theme that runs underneath the theme of the accounting for choices that one made in a world in which all the rules have changed. So let me begin with where the book begins, more or less, which is how I came to Eastern Europe. People always ask me, especially in Eastern Europe, why did you become interested in Eastern Europe? And the assumption is always that it has something to do with Jewish roots, which is a perfectly logical assumption, although I think in my case that was not actually what brought me to Eastern Europe. What brought me to Eastern Europe was having been at an particularly impressionable age in 1989. I mean, I didn't know anything about communism then, but as the last generation growing up in the Cold War, I understood that this part of the world that had always been between lock and key, that the division of the world which had formed, the dominant paradigm under which I had grown up, was suddenly from one day to the next, it was just over. I mean, it's just over. What was behind lock and key just suddenly opened. And that openness was extremely seductive. And I was particularly caught up in the fairy tale of the Velvet Revolution, of the Václav Havel, the imprisoned playwright who leaves prison and gets to live in a beautiful castle, and everything he said sounded very beautiful. I don't know if you remember this, but in November 1989, there's the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. December 1989, Havel becomes the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia. February 1990, he goes to Washington to make his first speech before the American Congress as the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia. And Havel says, against, I've later heard the advice of Madeleine Albright, who tries to coach him and fails. He gets up before the American Congress and says, "Consciousness precedes being, and not the other way around," as the Marxists claim. Now, of course, nobody had any idea what that meant. But it sounded very, very beautiful. I'm very skeptical that any of the people in Congress actually remember that moment in the German ideology where Marx and Engels talk about being precedes consciousness. But it sounded very beautiful, and one of the American commentators there said, "Wow, if I could talk like that, I would run for God." But when I then came to former communist Eastern Europe for the first time a few years later, I came with an interest in learning about the political philosophy of the Czechoslovak dissidents. And I very quickly learned that there were three things, most importantly, I had not understood. The first thing I had not understood was that I had somehow assumed that because people like Havel and the dissidents were the human rights activists against the communist totalitarians, because they were the good guys against the bad guys, then they must really be Western liberals. And they must really have been coming from the same trajectory of political theory that, eventually you go through Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Mill and the Tocqueville papers, and eventually you end up as good Western liberals. What I gradually realized as I then started to talk to people there and started to read Havel more closely and started to read other thinkers more closely was that what was important was not, in fact, people like Locke and Tocqueville and Mill, but rather Heidegger and Levinas. And that this intellectual heritage was not about liberalism, and that they were not necessarily liberals. Not only, and this is the second thing I learned, was that this philosophy not about liberalism, and they were not necessarily liberals, but they were also not really democratic populists. I had had this vision that people like Havel, who comes to the presidency and gets to live in the castle to the cheers of everybody, somehow represented the people and spoke for the people. I envisioned them as kind of Abbie Hoffmans, of sorts, who were going to liberate the people, the Abbie Hoffmans of democratic activism. What I gradually learned was that, in fact, this was a tradition of dissent that was profoundly cynical about the people as such. And one of the things I did that first summer of 1993 when I was in Prague and Bratislava is that I obsessively read and reread Havel's text, The Power of the Powerless. And I still think when everything is said and done, Havel's greatest contribution will have been this particular text. But in that text, which he writes in 1978, under the inspiration of having met Adam Michnik and some of the Polish dissidents for the first time on a kind of secret meeting on the border in a little village in the Tatra Mountains, and is dedicated to Jan Patočka, the great philosopher who had just died of a brain hemorrhage as a result of brutal interrogations. The text, The Power of the Powerless, posits a character of the greengrocer. And the greengrocer is your ordinary guy in the streets. He's neither a communist nor a dissident. He's just an ordinary person trying to get along. And every morning, the greengrocer goes into his store. And next to the carrots and the onions, he puts the sign in his window saying, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel asks, why does he put the sign in his window? Is he putting the sign in the window out of a sincere, spontaneous desire to acquaint passers-by with his faith in the coming of the glorious socialist revolution? And Havel says no, he doesn't believe the sign. The people who walk by and see the sign don't believe the sign. Not even the communist regime believes the sign. Moreover, the regime knows that the people don't believe it. And people know that the regime knows that they know. I mean, everybody knows. I mean, it's an emperor's new clothes situation. Everyone knows the emperor's naked, and the emperor knows that everyone's naked, that he's naked, and he knows that everyone knows he's naked, but nonetheless, everyone continues to play the game. And Havel says, well, what else can the greengrocer do? I mean, he's powerless. He has to put the sign at his window. I mean, for instance, what if one day he were to decide to take down that sign and perhaps bury it at the box of a bottom of rotten tomatoes or something? Well, somebody could inform on him. Somebody might ask questions. The police could come. He could be detained. He could be interrogated. His children could be denied access to higher education. He could have his permission to take a vacation taken away from him. And Havel says, well, why would all these bad things befall the greengrocer if he were to take that sign down? That suggests that the hanging of that sign is in fact very important to the regime. In fact, if one day all the greengrocers were to take down their signs, that would be the beginning of a revolution. Therefore, the greengrocer is not so powerless after all. Because he is powerful, he is also responsible and therefore guilty. For it's the greengrocers who allow the game to go on in the first place. And this is what Havel says that's so devastating in this essay. He says everyone is implicated because in this system, the line between victim and oppressor runs de facto through each one of us. For every one of us in his or her own way is both a victim and a supporter of the system. So that was the second thing. One, they were not liberals. Two, they did not believe in the people. And three, and this I realized not through Havel, but from beginning to read the people who were gathered around these dissident circles with Havel, mostly who were older than Havel was, and realizing that a lot of these people who signed the Human Rights Initiative Charter 77, for instance, who were the dissidents and emigres of the 70s and 80s, had been the revisionist Marxist. That is the reform communist of the 1960s, striving to create a socialism with a human face, a kinder, gentler kind of socialism. And then it turns out that a lot of these same people who were the dissidents and emigres of the 70s and 80s, who had been the revisionist Marxists of the 1960s, had still earlier, as young people, been the fanatical young communist of the 40s and 50s. And this is really Mellon Kundera's generation. Which is something people don't realize today, but is very much present, even in the writing of somebody like Kundera, who does not want to talk about this at all. You know, if you read moments, for instance, in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, and Kundera says, and don't forget when the communists in Czechoslovakia take power in February 1948, it is not to bloodshed and violence, but to the cheers of about half the population. And don't forget, he says, the half that cheered was the more intelligent, the more dynamic, the better half. So I became then very interested in Mellon Kundera's generation, who comes to communism during the war, through the war, when communism is already Stalinism. And in trying to understand what then led the best and the brightest minds, who later end up as human rights activists very often. I started to look at this feeling of the betrayal at Munich. In English, we always say the appeasement at Munich. In Czech, they always say the betrayal at Munich. And I began to talk to people like Haim Margolis Kowali, whose husband, Rudolf Margolis, was one of the Czech Jews that was hanged in the communist show trial, the Slansky trial of 1952. She and her husband had come to communism literally through Auschwitz. They were Czech Jews who were Holocaust survivors. And talking to her, and then talking to people like Arno Schlustig from that same generation, also people who were dissidents and emigres, and previously revisionist Marxist and previously young Stalinist, and people like Haim Margolis and Arnost were saying to me, listen, in the camps, in Auschwitz, the communists were the best people. They were the only ones with the resources and the solidarity and the discipline and the vision that there was going to be something better to come. And so I became then very interested in the trajectory of that generation, how that experience of kind of going through the war led them to Stalinism, and to a Stalinism that they were often very reluctant to let go of. Czechoslovakia in particular was very slow to de-Stalinize. Not much happens in 1953. In 1956, Khrushchev gives that so-called secret speech, which doesn't remain secret for very long, in which he opens the Pandora's box to talking about Stalin's excess as a very qualified admission, but still what opened the door. And the Czech and the Slovak intellectuals and philosophers, they have a conference, and they're forced to confront what Khrushchev said about the excesses and the cult of personality. And people like Stanislav Neumann get up there and say, listen, my generation, we grew up with Stalin's name. And my best friends, they went to their deaths in the Nazi camps with his name on their lips. Well, now you're telling me, well, no, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not ashamed. So it was through kind of probing then this generation that I became interested in the question of the inextricability of the Nazi and Stalinist experiences. And that then was going to kind of take me, well, one of the things that then happened was that I realized, at first I had, you see this infinite regression problem that historians had, because first I was preoccupied with understanding the philosophy of dissent in the 70s and 80s, and then I realized that if you wanted to understand dissent, you really had to first understand revisionist Marxism, and then I realized if you really had to understand revisionist Marxism, you had to first understand Stalinism, and then I realized if you really want to understand Stalinism, you have to understand the experience of the war. And then I thought, well, if I really want to then understand the experience of the Second World War, then I shouldn't be in Prague, I should be in Warsaw. Because why be on the periphery when you can be in the center? And I was young and I had a lot of time, and having spent this ridiculous amount of time learning Czech, I then decided to go to Warsaw and learn Polish. And one of the things I then wandered across very quickly after arriving in Warsaw is how the Polish-Jewish question was impossible to disentangle from the Jews and communism question. And let me say a little bit about that, especially since we're at YIVO, and a lot of this book deals with this question about Poles and Jews and communism. One of the aims in the book is to situate the debate about what the Poles call Židokomuna, and what is imperfectly translated into English as Judeo-Bolshevism, which I would define very briefly as the impression that communism in general and Stalinism in particular was a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy against the Poles. One of the aims of this book is to situate both Judeo-Bolshevism and the Jedwabny debate in a broader context of post-communist accounting with the past. And so the Polish-Jewish questions that are really at the heart of this book, they're a kind of a certain prism. They're a case that I think reveals the inextricability of these two totalitarian experiences that Eastern Europe had this century. And I first kind of went, well, when I first decided that if I really want to understand Stalinism, I have to understand the Second World War, and then I should go to Warsaw, I then went to see one of my professors who was from Warsaw when I was at University of Toronto writing my MA, which I just started to learn Polish, and I already knew Czech. And he was giving me, he was very nice, and he was giving me letters of introduction to his colleagues in Warsaw. And I was just about to take the letters and leave, and I was about to leave very shortly thereafter. I had a Fulbright to go to Warsaw for a year. And he looked at me with a very worried expression on his face. And he said, I feel like I'm sending this delicate young person into a nest of snakes. And I have to say, I never say anything like that to my graduate students now. When I send them off to do their research, I always say something cheerful and hopeful and encouraging. And I said, well, why are you saying that? And he says something about Polish-Jewish something, and I said, but there can't be very many Jews left in Warsaw today. I mean, how bad could Polish-Jewish relations really be? And he said, Marci, let me explain it this way. Imagine you have a little brother. And imagine that little brother dies in some kind of horrible accident for which you feel partially responsible. Can you imagine how at subsequent family gatherings such an event could spoil the family atmosphere? So this is what I had in my mind in 1997, in early 1997, when I first went to Warsaw. And Warsaw in 1997 was a pretty bleak place in overdetermined ways. And in fact, it was a place with a lot of anti-Semitic graffiti. Really a lot of anti-Semitic graffiti, considering there were not very many Jews. A lot of Stars of David hanging on gallows. And I have to put this in context by saying that Polish graffiti in the 1990s had a whole discourse of gallows motif. If you didn't like a football team, you hung them on gallows. Anything you didn't like was hung on gallows. It was a whole conversation that occurred vis-a-vis hanging, things on gallows. So there are all these stars of David dangling on gallows. And shortly after I got there, a new Polish-Jewish magazine began to appear that was funded in large part by the American Lauder Foundation. The magazine was called Midrash, and it was edited by Kostek Gebert, who was one of the leading figures in Solidarity, in the underground press, who was one of Poland's best journalists and had been their most important foreign correspondent in Bosnia during the Yugoslav wars. And Kostek was now editing this new Polish-Jewish magazine. And in the second issue, a half-page advertisement appeared. And the advertisement read, "Do you have Jewish roots? Is it a problem? A secret? Have you been afraid to tell your colleagues, your friends, perhaps your children, your husband or your wife?" And it went on to advertise a confidential hotline where you could call and discuss the problems you were having with your Jewish identity. And the last line of the advertisement was, "Zapewniamy dyskrecję." We guarantee discretion, we guarantee confidentiality. And I thought it was a bad joke. I mean, it was kind of like a kind of satire of Alcoholics Anonymous advertisements. And I went to see Kostek, and he said, "Oh no, it's not a joke." And they get a lot of calls. And it was the moment at which I started to absorb that it was not a joke, that I started to just begin to penetrate the layers of the issues involved in Polish-Jewish angst. I should say that the magazine, as Kostek explained, was really aimed at closet Jews, people who might have some kind of Jewish origin or suspect that they might have some kind of Jewish origin, but would never publicly identify, but maybe they would be interested in reading something about it. Without any commitment, maybe they would just be interested in reading something about it. So I subscribed to Midrash, and every month that the magazine arrived in a kind of unmarked brown envelope. The next thing that happened this year that I want to mention that might put some of these things in context, and maybe even some of you were present there, I don't know. In 1997 in Warsaw, there was a large conference to commemorate the 100th year anniversary of the Bund. The conference was co-sponsored by the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the German Historical Institute, which I think essentially paid for the whole thing. And it was professors who came, scholars who came from all over Europe, from Israel, from the United States. Somebody came from Australia. And it was simultaneous translation, Polish and English, which I say is very standard for any kind of international scholarly conference, that you do simultaneous translation, local language plus English as a kind of international academic language. And the other people who came to this conference, besides, several dozen scholars of the Bund, were a handful of elderly men in their 80s and 90s, the last surviving Bundist. And at a certain point, one of them stood up and said, "This is a Bund conference. I want to speak Yiddish." And of course, there was no translator from Yiddish. But a Yiddishist from New York stood up then and said, yes, speak Yiddish, speak Yiddish. So then people started kind of jumping up and, translating in a kind of ad hoc way. And what this elderly man wanted to say, and who he wanted to scream at, were the Israeli professors, who I should say all of whom, as far as I recall, were too young to have been involved in any of this. I mean, they were all born after the war. They were strictly scholars of the Bund and not participants in interwar Polish-Jewish history. And they said to the Israeli scholars, "You killed our language. You persecuted our culture." And the Israelis, of course, then jump up and start shouting that the Zionists didn't kill the Bund. The Holocaust killed the Bund. And in moments, it was just pandemonium. And the organizers completely lost control of their conference. And I was fascinated. I mean, I was totally fascinated. And one of the things that fascinated, just the anger that could never be made okay, the resentment that could never be made okay, that was so raw, the pain that was so raw, and the hostility in the room and the past that just appeared at a moment as if it had happened yesterday. But also the fact that here you have these people screaming at one another. Here you have pandemonium. And this is just the Jewish question. They had not yet even begun to talk about the Poles. So to put the Polish-Jewish question in context, one of the things I learned is that one had to first understand the Jewish question in order to appreciate the Polish-Jewish question. And I want to say that as context for something, I talk about the book quite a bit, which is the Jedwabne controversy. And I'll go through that very briefly because I'm sure many of you already know what that was about. But in spring of 2000, Jan Gross publishes a very slim book, a little micro-history called Neighbors. And Neighbors tells the story of a massacre that takes place in a very small town far away from Warsaw in Poland's eastern provinces in July 1941. Now, July 1941 follows 21 months of Soviet rule in this little Polish town. So as I'm sure all of you here sitting in this room know, September 1st, 1939, the Germans come and invade from the west, and September 17th, the Red Army comes from the east, and Poland disappears, essentially, and it is occupied by those two powers. Jedwabne had come under Soviet occupation. Then, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler unilaterally breaks the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression treaty and attacks the Soviet Union. The Red Army withdraws. The Germans show up, but they haven't yet really set up their occupation regime. And in this space, which is literally a space of semi-anarchy between two totalitarianisms, they give the Poles a few days to take care of the Jews. And what happens is that the Poles in this town massacre their German neighbors. They massacre them individually with farm tools, and in the end, they herd the remaining Jews into the town square, into a barn, and they set the barn on fire. It's a particularly gruesome massacre. Now, Neighbors was a very personal book, and it was a provocation in the first place to Jan Gross's friends and colleagues, saying, you haven't touched the material. And saying to himself, why haven't I touched this material? Why have we all sat on this for the past 40 years? But one of the things that comes up in the debate about Jedwabne that follows this book, and I won't again go in detail in the debate because I'm sure many of you know what happened. It was arguably the most important debate to happen in Europe since the Historiker strike. I think it was certainly the most important debate about the Holocaust to happen in post-communist Europe. But one of the things that comes out is how deeply the question about collaboration with the Nazis was intertwined with the question about collaboration with the Stalinist. Because for those who, and I should say there were many Poles who rose to the occasion and confronted the situation with tremendous courage and honesty. Of those who resisted, and of those who were either apologists or defenders of those Poles who massacred their neighbors in Jedwabne, the line tended to be that Poles never would have done this, but if they did, it was only because the Jews deserved it for having collaborated with the Soviets. And so how this question of Polish anti-Semitism, Polish collaboration with the Nazis against the Jews, became inextricable from the question of Jewish collaboration with the Soviets against the Poles. And one of the things I deal with in this book a lot is probing that very, very painful question of Poles, Jews, and communism. And communists who represented a very small minority of the interwar Jewish population overall. And the communists represented a very small minority of the interwar Polish population overall. The interwar Communist Party of Poland, which was an illegal party, had a membership that's estimated to be about 7,000. The Jews, which were about 10% of the population, were overrepresented in that party 2 to 3 times. So say 25 to 33% of the party, and they were even more overrepresented in the intelligentsia and the party leadership. So again, overall, the numbers are small, but percentage-wise, there's a distinct overrepresentation phenomenon. And of course, what complicates this is that while these Jews who were communists were perceived as Jews, they themselves often rejected this identification, both in favor of internationalism and in favor of Polishness. And one of the ironies about this is that, that these Polish Jewish communists were often, to use an infamous Marxist distinction, subjectively Polonophile, even if they were objectively anti-Polish. And so one of the storylines I pursue in this book has to do with the drama of these Polish Jewish communists, particularly those who then come to play key roles in the Stalinist regime. And I try to go back and look at what it meant to choose communism in the interwar years. Choosing communism in the interwar years was, of course, very different from choosing communism in the post-war years. In the interwar years, there was no space for opportunism. In the interwar years, you generally knew you were going to sit in prison if you joined the illegal Polish Communist Party. It meant that you would sit in prison. It meant that you would participate in hunger strikes. Prisons, in fact, were kinds of universities for communists. Alexander Vatt, when he finally gets himself arrested after trying quite hard, looks at these people studying fervently Marx and Engels and Hegel in prison, and says, wow, they must have all had Talmudic education in their childhood. You don't get that kind of memory for text any other way. And then Polish Jewish communists like Michal Mirski, who, when they do from time to time get themselves out of prison and internment camps, what do? They start translating Hegel into Yiddish. I mean, there's a whole drama of these people who honestly and selflessly chose communism when there was no space for opportunism. There's also the additional layer that sometimes those people who were Polish Jewish communists in the interwar years and sit in prison in the interwar years are going to end up being deported along with hundreds of thousands of other Polish citizens to Soviet labor camps during the Second World War. They will sometimes return to Poland after the war still as communist. Because, as one of them told me, while, yes, people were dying in the Soviet camps, at least you weren't dying in the gas chambers, And so being sent to a Soviet camp where many, many people were dying still gave you a greater chance of survival than being sent to a Nazi extermination camps. Some would later go on to play key roles in the post-war Stalinist regime. And some of them then later would be purged. And under Stalin's famous anti-cosmopolitan campaign, which is an anti-Semitic campaign, and which sees trials like the Slansky trial of 1952, in which Rudolf Margolis and other Czech Jews are executed. And then eventually in Poland will come 1968 in the anti-Zionist campaign, and then you will see kind of the last children to be devoured by the revolution. But let me, so I don't go on here too long, say a little bit about how I approach this. One of the things I talk about is communism as a kind of family drama, a Freudian family romance, both synchronically and diachronically. Synchronically, because what you see time after time are divided families. So as you, I'm sure you remember from Shalom Alechem's Tevye the Dairyman and Fiddler on the Roof, Jewish modernity is a family drama. And that was very much true for the Polish Jews and communism question. And it is not infrequent for brothers to end up on different sides. And one of the stories I tell are about the Behrman Brothers, Adolf and Jakob, who are two children of a family of 5 children born around the turn of the century, a Polish-Jewish family in Warsaw. When of 3 sons, one joins Poletzion right, one joins Poletzion left, and Jakob most infamously joins the Communist Party of Poland. And at a certain point, Mieczysław, the one who joins Poletzion right, he's going to be killed in Treblinka. He's not going to survive the Second World War. But Adolf, who's a leader of Poletzion left, will, and Jakob Behrman will. And at a certain moment, they will find themselves on opposite sides, and Adolf Behrman is going to then leave the country. And that's a whole other interesting story. And he's going to go to Israel, in which he will later become a member of the Knesset. So I became very interested in pursuing this family and these siblings that make different choices at a moment when the world was being radically remade, this kind of epic human drama. And one of the things I found in Adolf Behrman's archive in Tel Aviv were letters from somebody named Haim Finkelstein, who was the editor of Hind, of Warsaw's largest Yiddish newspaper in the interwar years. Letters to Adolf Behrman from Haim Finkelstein beginning in 1944, in which Haim Finkelstein, who's gone to the United States in the late 1930s, remained there during the war, is hysterically trying to find news of his wife and 2 daughters who stayed in Poland. And this correspondence continues. The wife and 1 daughter do die in the Holocaust, and another daughter survives and eventually joins her father in New York. In any case, these letters continue for decades until Adolf Behrman's death in the late 1970s. And I decided that, well, I should say first I decided to see if I could track down potentially the other half of the correspondence. And I assumed that Haim Finkelstein must be long dead. But I knew that the daughter who had gone to New York was potentially alive. And so I wrote to Adolf Behrman's son, who is a psychoanalyst, like all good children of radical Marx, a psychoanalyst in Israel, and asked him if he had any kind of an address for the daughter. And he writes me back and he says, I have cousins in Warsaw and they think Haim Finkelstein is still alive. And I think, well, that's very unlikely. If Haim Finkelstein were still alive, he'd have to be 100 years old or so. But in any case, I write a letter to the daughter and say that I'm coming to New York and I'll be staying with my brother. And I get to New York, and I'm at a conference at Columbia, and then I get this very excited voicemail message from my brother and sister-in-law on the Upper West Side saying that they have gotten a voicemail message from Haim Finkelstein himself, back from the dead. So I go to the Bronx to see him. It's 1999. Haim Finkelstein was born in the 19th century. He was 100 years old when I get there. And he says, well, what do you want to know? And I said, well, what was it that happened in the interwar years in the 1920s that Mieczysław joins Poletzki on right, and Adolf joins Poletzki on left, and Jakub joins the Communist Party of Poland? In the meantime, his wife, this is his second wife, was in the kitchen making lunch, and so I had to warn her that I was a vegetarian, which is never very good with the Poles. And he said, listen, so you're a vegetarian? And I said, yes. And he said, you have brothers, right? He'd called me at my brother's house. And I said, yes, I have 2 brothers. He said, okay, are they vegetarians? And I said, well, one is a vegetarian, but the youngest one isn't. He said, okay, so one brother is a vegetarian, and the other brother is not a vegetarian. So Adolf was a Zionist and Jakub was a communist. And then his wife starts yelling at him in Polish. She says, Haim, the girl came all the way to the Bronx. You can tell her why Jakub became a communist. But from his point of view, I could never understand a world that was so long past. His world that could never come again, that had gone up in flames so long ago, there was no point in talking to me. So in any case, so communism as a family drama, I try to tell this story both synchronically as divided families and also diachronically as a kind of Oedipal drama and as a kind of Freudian family romance. And 3 generations of Polish Jews in particular figure in this book. One is the generation of Adolf and Jakub Behrman, the generation of Polish Jewish communists who then become Stalinist. The generation of people like Alexander Mashevitsky, who says to me, who survives with his wife the Soviet camps and returns to Poland after the war, still as a communist, because yes, people were dying in the Soviet camps, but not in the ovens. It was a non-trivial distinction at that particular moment. And then the generation of their children, and the generation of March 1968, those who then had the experience, to a large extent, of being raised and privileged as the children of communist and a communist regime, who then come to play an extraordinary role in leading the student revolts of March 1968, who not infrequently end up in prison, and then both those who stay in Poland and those who emigrate, who not infrequently end up playing leading roles in solidarity and in the anti-communist opposition. There's a kind of analogy to the generation of 68 here in Germany, a revolt against the silences of their parents. And also a feeling of guilt by contiguity. A feeling of somehow an implication in the crimes of Stalinism by contiguity. Adam Michnik, who was one of these people, writes very movingly about how those of us who were their children, we will live and die to the end with that Christian blemish. And so I look at then that generation who revolts against their parents, and Kostek Gebert is one of those people as well, who is editing Midrash, the Polish Jewish magazine. And in one of the many conversations we had about this topic, Kostek, who is the child of Polish Jewish Stalinist, and he says, listen, everything good in me I have from my parents. If I devoted a decade or so of my life to tearing down the system that they built, it was because of the values that they taught me. And then I look also at the generation, the next generation, the generation of the grandchildren, of people born primarily in the late 60s and the 1970s, who are the grandchildren of Polish-Jewish Stalinists, who are the children of solidarity activists, who not infrequently were baptized. You know, part of solidarity was the fact that Pope John Paul II was its patron saint. To baptize your child at that time was a sign of moral freedom. In the 1990s, they start discovering that they are perhaps of Jewish origin, and they feel burdened in some ways by both these legacies. And one thing I should say to put this generation in context is that while I mentioned before that the number of Jews who become communist in the interwar years is in overall numbers very, very small, there was a kind of bewildering array of political choices. And you could not be political, of course. You know, you could be a traditional Jew or a secular Jew. You could be an Orthodox Jew or a Hasidic Jew. You know, you could be a Zionist. It could be a religious Zionist. You could be a socialist Zionist. You could be a far-right Zionist. You could be a centrist Zionist. There were a zillion socialist Zionists, you know, parties, some of which were kind of communist Zionist parties, some of which were kind of social democratic Zionist parties. You could be a Bundist, you could be a Hebraist, you could be a Yiddishist. You had this bewildering array of options. But the Jews who remain in Poland today, and in the 1990s, I should say, to struggle with their Jewish identity, they are not a random sample of the Jewish population as it used to exist before the war. You know, first of all, most of the Jews who lived in Poland before the war were killed. Those who survived were not an arbitrary sample. It was not totally random if you survived. Moreover, most of the ones who survived and returned to Poland after the war, at which they were confronting both with encroaching communist totalitarianism and with anti-Semitic violence, get out very quickly upon getting back. You know, and then another wave of them, you know, leave when they're next giving out exit visas in the 1950s, and then 13,000 more immigrate with the anti-Zionist campaign in 1968. In any case, the ones who stayed after the war, the survivors who stayed after the war when everyone left, were not a random sample. They were by and large the people who were absolutely committed to building socialism in Poland. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there. And therefore, these Jews now who are struggling with their Jewish identity of this next generation, you know, of this younger generation, are not a random sample, but they are by and large the children of Polish-Jewish, the children of Polish-Jewish, the grandchildren of Polish-Jewish Stalinists. And one thing that struck me was the poignancy with which they conjured up the debates of the 1930s. I mean, I would have dinner with, you know, the last, you know, 6 Polish Jews in their 20s, and this is the 1990s, and suddenly 5 minutes into the dinner, and they're screaming at one another because they have divided themselves into the Hebraicist and the Yiddishist and the assimilationist and the anti-assimilationist and the Zionist and the diaspora nationalist, and I mean it's over. I mean it's all. I mean you can decide that you're going to be a Bundist, you know, in Warsaw in 1997, but there's no Bund. But part of the process by which they tried to figure out what this meant was precisely going back to the 1920s and 1930s. And then asking provocative questions like, if we do decide to claim Jewishness, if we do decide that there is a rich heritage of Jewish learning and Jewish culture, if we're proud of Freud, then how do we relate to Yaakov Behrman? How do we relate to Yaakov Behrman, who was a notorious, I should say, a notorious member of a triumvirate of Stalinist leaders in the bloodiest period of Polish Stalinism, and the one who was in charge of the security apparatus. And these were not easy questions to answer. So a lot of the book deals with those 3 generations. It's part of, I think, a larger preoccupation I have with generations, with how at certain moments of historical drama and historical extremity, generational cleavages form in very short periods of time, with questions of guilt by contiguity, with Helmut Kohl's notion of what it means to have the grace of a late birth, what it means to be able to ask questions about, you know, the past of those older than you are, knowing that you cannot be implicated because you were not born or you were too young. And it deals with Havel's faith in this untainted generation. I mean, Havel takes up this idea that was perhaps first expressed by Robespierre during the French Revolution, which is, we have raised the temple of liberty with hands still withered by the cross of despotism. Because we have created the new world. Yes, it's Robespierre. We have raised the temple of liberty with hands still withered by the cross of despotism. That is, how do you create the new world when the builders of that new world are somehow always already contaminated by having been formed by the old world? Yes. Well, it's not just dirty hands. It's having been formed. It's not necessarily about moral guilt. It's having been formed. I mean, and Havel very much believed that. I mean, he believed that you will only have a generation that really creates new values when basically a generation totally unformed by communism comes of age, when those of us who were already shaped by those experiences have died off. And the book ends precisely with this new generation in Poland, with Poland's new left, which has been very interested in Polish-Jewish questions, at the center of which are people who are now in their 20s and their 30s, who were, by and large, too young to have been formed by communism. And they are postmodernist. They are in some ways, students of French, French postmodernist theory, who nevertheless share a certain epistemological optimism with the generation of '68 that answers can be found. They would like to build something again. And they are now asking questions of the past, not from the point of view of hostility or guilt by contiguity, but from the point of view of being a generation removed and wanting to move forward. So the book ends with Poland's new left. So let me just, because I've been talking for a while, say a couple things in conclusion, what the book is about, if it tells a story, if there is a story. Well, the book is about, in very simple terms, the fact that the fall of communism had a dark side, that there was no happy ending, that the principle Isaiah Berlin was preoccupied with is in fact correct, which is that not all good things go together. Some good things exclude other good things. That guilt and innocence are often very much entangled. It's a book that affirms, I would say, a Hegelian reading of morality against a Kantian one. And let me just briefly tell you what I mean by that. So Kant's notion of morality was that it all has to do with your intentions. It's intentions that count. And Hegel, in the phenomenology of spirit, I have to acknowledge that I owe this understanding of Hegel to the philosopher J. Bernstein at the New School. Hegel says that this is inadequate. Intentions are inadequate. Because the thing about history and the thing about life, Hegel says, is that actions not only occasionally, but as a rule have consequences well in excess of their intentions. And I found this very resonant in trying to understand 20th century Eastern Europe. And part of the tragedy of 20th century Eastern Europe is that there were moments in which there were no innocent choices. There were moments people found themselves in which anything you chose was a betrayal of someone or something, in which anything you chose caused suffering. Nonetheless, one had to choose. And tragedy was endemic. It's a book about how very few people really get out with clean hands, which leads the historian to a problem of understanding. The Polish poet Wisława Szymborska famously writes, "We know ourselves only insofar as we have been tested." And the book looks self-reflectively at what it means to be the historian and what it means to write history. And I do believe that to write history well means to try to understand. To try to understand means to empathize. To empathize comes with various risks, two in particular. One, I think there is a risk of moral relativism that comes with the striving for empathy, which I do believe is essential. And this book very much struggles with the ambivalence of moral questions and the morally ambivalent position of the historian. This book draws upon letters that people write to their daughter, to their husband, to their father in the hours before they were hanged. It involves, reading letters that a father wrote, about his sons who were in prison, which was never meant for the sons to see. The book involves reading diaries and reading letters and reading things that were never meant to be seen. To be in Eastern Europe in the 1990s was to be a voyeur. And this is a deeply exploitative book. And that the moral problem I end with for the historian in some ways parallel to the moral problem, which is the tragedy of Eastern Europe. What do you do when there are no innocent choices to be made? Is that in order to understand the past, it requires a leap of empathy. That is an empathy that can only ever be born in voyeurism. Thank you.
I have a question. You historians of Eastern Europe, are right now in a very privileged position that you do not have to be only voyeur, but you can be an active agent. You can be active agent in the question of how one deals with the guilt, because it's the historian who has to give the history to those who do not want to hear the history. The historian has to be able to inform those people who will see the ads that you mentioned, and there are people who know they are Jewish, don't know it perfectly well, they just don't know, and they hope that nobody else that knows that they're Jewish, and they don't want to know because they don't want to see the reaction from the non-Jewish. And the non-Jewish person has that reaction because they have to come to terms with the history of their parents, grandparents, that they haven't been told completely, or if they were, they would not like to know about it. But it's the historian, isn't it, who has to be the active agent? How can you be an active agent in Eastern Europe right now? Not, just a voyeur.
Right, well, that's an understanding born in voyeur. No, you're right. I mean, one of the things that's both compelling and terrifying about being a historian in Eastern Europe is the sense that it matters, that what you write matters, which I think as American, I mean, as a historian who's American and functioning at an American university, we're not used to it mattering so much. I mean, there's something, you go over there and people really care. And they care not just in a kind of scholarly sense and not just in the sense of academic politics. They really, really care. And therefore, there really is a sense of tremendous responsibility. And when my first book was published in Polish, I was just kind of blown away by the intensity with which it was discussed because people cared so much. And this was a book about people who were all of whom were dead, but they still cared so much, which is a very heavy burden. I mean, in which makes you feel like you have to choose your words very carefully. Because it matters to people, and because in Polish they actually talk about things like polityka historyczna, like historical politics or historical policy, which is a concept that doesn't even make so much sense. But I mean, you actually have states and cultures trying to define a kind of law in the past, and there was these countries have now, almost all of them, I think, institutes of national remembrance, which are institutions which are charged with educating the public, about the past, and particularly about the past of Nazism and communism. They are charged with overseeing the former secret police archives. They're charged with prosecuting crimes to the extent that those crimes can still be prosecuted. And they're institutes with tremendous power. There was a few years ago a law in Poland passed concerning Poland's Institute for National Remembrance, in which the law actually made it punishable by up to 3 years in prison for anyone to, quote unquote, implicate the Polish nation or members thereof in the crimes of Nazism or communism. Now, I mean, of course, this is obviously completely absurd, and my friend and colleague Dariusz Stola, who's a Polish historian, wrote an essay in Anna Michnik's newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, who said, well, as a historian, I'm going to assume that this was just thoughtlessness and not idiocy. Because if no one who was a member of the Polish nation had anything to do with, either the Nazi occupation or with communism in Poland, then why are we even concerned about the opening of the secret police archives? Because we know we had nothing to do with it, and we know that it must have all been done by Martians. There's a certain kind of absurdity, but the attempt to create, because the past is so terrifying, And because the opening of the archives is so terrifying, the attempt to create and actually to kind of legislate a kind of policy on it has been very powerful. And that's one of the reasons why the Kundera affair in the Czech Republic and Slovakia has been so vicious. More questions? Maybe I should let Jonathan call on people since you like.
Are you familiar with the work of the French priest Father Dubois?
Yes, yes.
He was just here at NYU. Unfortunately, it was the Monday night, if you can believe this, at the end of Passover. So you can guess that there were very few people in the audience. At any rate, his interviews with Polish villagers who were actually present at the deaths of hundreds, thousands of Jews from their own villages, and their willingness to talk about this, as he actually has these interviews, it's an astonishing thing. And I don't know exactly, I asked him about the relationship between the fall of communism and the willingness of people to speak, the Polish villagers to speak about what they were directly involved in. And he didn't see much connection between that. But at any rate, it's an astonishing thing, the willingness of these villagers to talk about what they did or what they witnessed.
That's interesting. I mean, his project, as I say, I haven't followed it that closely, but I've seen some of those videos, and I saw an exhibit at Paris in the Jewish Museum in Paris, in which some of his first material about these Ukrainian villagers came out. It's an extraordinary project, actually going into the provinces and talking to people. One thing that actually I think my husband Tim Snyder first observed and was pushing some of our Polish colleagues on, that I have found striking, is that it's off the people who are so defensive and so protective about peasants and about villagers and about whether or not there could have actually been anti-Semitism in the countryside, often tends to be right-wing intelligentsia types from the cities as opposed to the actual villagers themselves. I mean, it is quite striking, that, when things like Jedwabne happen, that so many people were actually willing to talk, that it turns out it wasn't actually that difficult if you go into the provinces for people to talk, but there were people, in institutes and in universities or, gathered around journals, in cities who were very, very defensive, kind of on their behalf. And that speaks to, I think, some kind of deep division in the intelligentsia. But I do think, like Anya Bekant wrote a wonderful book. I don't know if it's yet come out in English, but I think it's going to. But called Mi z Jedwabne, those of us, we from Jedwabne, in which after Jan Gross's book appears, she, as a former Solidarity leader and as a journalist at Gazeta Wyborcza, starts going to Jedwabne and hanging out there. And talking to people there. And it turns out people talk to her. And it turns out, yes, if you press people, often they will. They will tell you, and these narratives about national character and the protection of national character and the people forming historical policy and writing laws, like the law, making it punishable, those aren't actually the villagers. Who saw the massacre. Those are people speaking as if on their behalf. And that is an interesting contrast.
So your professor sent you off in the 1990s with that very encouraging analogy of the dead child, and that phrase I think he used was feelings of responsibility.
Wow.
And if I understand your talk, a big part of that was this reluctance or dilemma in acknowledging Jewish roots or communist roots. And some of your answers to questions touches on those feelings of responsibility, but I was just wondering if you had anything more to say about your encounter of his words of warning, and how they manifested themselves.
Well, I should say, in a certain sense, the whole book is about that. One of the things I would say is that I was, as an American living in Warsaw, I mean, I was there for maybe a total of 2 years or so while I was a graduate student, and then returned a lot after that. I was constantly coming into contact with American, Israeli, and European Jewish tourists who wanted to talk to me. I mean, maybe because I was an American, I spoke English, and say things like, how could Poles, live in this place that's a cemetery, and how could they just go about their normal lives and go to the movies and not care? And who walked around Warsaw, who really came to Warsaw, and who came to Poland, to make a pilgrimage to a cemetery, and came with tremendous bitterness against the people who lived on and therefore implicitly denigrated that cemetery. And I would say that my position was very different because, first of all, I lived there and I spoke Polish, so I saw much more anti-Semitism than the tourist did, because I understood what the graffiti meant. And I understood what the right-wing newspapers were saying, and when people were selling books on the streets, and some of those books were about worldwide Jewish conspiracies, I knew what those titles meant. I mean, I saw things tourists would never see and couldn't take in. But at the same time, I understood how you could live there and go to the movies because I lived there and I went to the movies. And I understood that in many ways, the people who were living there and going to the movies spent much more time thinking much more deeply and in a much more soul-searching way about those events all the time because they could never get away from them. So I should say I saw both sides of it. I mean, I saw the depths of the complexity, and Poland, like the United States, is a deeply, deeply divided country. And I had a student once, I was teaching at Indiana University, who came into my office and said, if you're really Jewish, how can you live in a horrible anti-Semitic country like Poland so often? And at this time, we were in Bloomington, Indiana, about 35 minutes down the road in the town of Martinsville, the Ku Klux Klan was known to be hanging out. And I'm like, listen, how can you really live in this horrible racist country? We all know that the Ku Klux Klan, still has this kind of hangout, half an hour down the road. Well, kind of in the same way. And that was a kind of tension I lived within all the time, because while I saw anti-Semitism that other Jews and other tourists would never see, I also saw the other side. And I saw Polish intellectuals who were deeply, in a very soul-searching way, engaged in coming to terms with these problems on a very profound level, and I think understanding layers of complexity that people who didn't live in Poland would never understand. And I think in some ways still arguably the best book about the Warsaw Ghetto is the book written by Jacek Lewczak and Barbara Engelking, a kind of a guide to the Warsaw Ghetto, which I think has come out in English. Has it come out in English? It has come out in English. And then that was a book that could only have been written by people from Warsaw. You could never get inside the ghetto that way and really have begun to commune and see in your mind each street and block by block and what was in what shop and what sign was hanging there and how someone in the uprising might have gotten from this place to that place. That was a book that could only have been written by people from Warsaw. And that was something that American Jews couldn't do. So I see that too. That'd be the short answer.
Don't you also have to look at the attitude of the Germans towards Poland, the Untermenschen side of it? That is, whereby the Poles themselves, why they weren't in the category, I don't even suggest near the category of the Jews, but they were going to have their educational opportunities taken away from them. They were going to be used as labor. Shouldn't this whole commentary be sort of looked on at that as well, because you didn't mention that?
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I didn't mention that here, but that underlies everything. And that's absolutely true, and that is part of what for a long time I think dominated a certain motif of Polish Jewish discourse and attempts to reconcile, which was a certain kind of competition over martyrdom and a feeling that Jews had monopolized a legacy of martyrdom and stolen it from the Poles. And that begins in some ways as well, during the communist era. Tomorrow is the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was, the great heroic act and the largest single act of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust, in which, a big chunk of Warsaw that was the Warsaw Ghetto gets burned to the ground. A couple of those survivors from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a very few survivals, namely the Bundesmark Edelman and two Zionists, Tzevi Lubetkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman, they go on to fight again a year later, which is something that's not generally known, in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 with Polish communist partisans, which is another story. That Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944, which lasts for 2 months, and ends in some way similar to the way the Ghetto Revolt ends, in that the Germans set fire to what remains of the city, and the whole thing is burnt to the ground, and the Poles lose. And the Red Army is just kind of sitting across the other side of the Vistula, waiting, and the Polish government exile is hysterically and desperately trying to get Churchill and Roosevelt to come bring aid to Warsaw. And Churchill and Roosevelt are sitting there saying, oh, don't worry, Stalin's Red Army is right there, they're going to come help you. Of course, they don't come help them. They sit on the other bank of that river and they watch Warsaw go up in flames. And then a few months later, in January 1945, they walk in and they pick up, the city. Yes. Yes, as a result, all those people die. And moreover, then the communists take power. And not only are the people who die not acknowledged properly the way they should have been, and not only is that act of heroism not acknowledged, but it's condemned by the communists, who then co-opt the legacy of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and use it as a kind of foundational heroic act and myth, in part in order to silence any kind of discussion about the Polish resistance, which is condemned by the communists, and after the war in a kind of civil war with the communists. And that naturally doesn't help Polish-Jewish relations. And that plays out for a really, really long time.
If I could just add one comment to all of this. I just not long ago returned from Vilnius, Lithuania. And those of you who know the situation in Lithuania, you know that the politics there between Lithuanians and Jews follow very much the same kind of track. There is a museum of genocide in Vilnius that does not mention the Holocaust. And so there is a very comparable competition for martyrdom. The memory of what is taken to be Jewish collaboration with the Soviets that led to deportations and shootings of Lithuanians before World War II and after World War II is still very, very active. It is not like the smallpox virus that's hidden in test tubes in some cave in Nevada. These ideas are very active within the population today, and I must say, when I lectured in Chicago about a year ago, I found that these ideas were still quite active in the emigre Lithuanian population in the United States as well. So the relevance of Marci's book goes far beyond the borderland of Poland and Czech Republic at this point. And I would say the same is true in Russia as well, with local differences.
I spent, at one point in my life, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out French communism, the Stalinist era. And when I conducted a lot of interviews, I found, to my great surprise, I guess, not cynicism, but really idealism. I found people, former communists, who could still speak about this ideal world, and who reminded me that in the heroic period, they walked around saying, not next year in Jerusalem, but next year in the People's Democracy. And discovered that these were idealistic people who wouldn't harm a fly, and yet were in a party that committed incredible crimes, and they were aware within the Communist Party of purges, ugly incidents that had occurred. Of course, they didn't end in shootings, as they did in Russia frequently, but were horrendous psychologically for people who were in the party. Could you comment about this a little more? I really appreciated in your talk your fleshing out the dimensions of the complexity of people who chose communism, because they were human and they lived human lives within its culture. But how did they manage these contradictions?
That's $1 million question. I mean, in some ways, that's what my whole first book is about. But I'll just say briefly, yes, that the epic human drama of what it meant to choose communism. And that was one of the things that drew me to that debate about morality between Kant and Hegel. Because the problem of good intentions and the disconnect between the good intentions and the horrifying consequences is, I mean, it's one of these situations. I mean, Hegel says that there are moments at which changes in scale become changes in kind, in which quantitative changes become so great as to become qualitative changes. You know, the sheer enormity of the experiment, the enormity of the hopes, and then the sheer enormity of the failure, you know, of the hell, of the catastrophe, and the guilt, and how one can ever live with the guilt. I mean, this really is a kind of Hegelian case in which actions have consequences far in excess of their intentions. And the whole time, you know, I was trying to figure out, how do you approach people like Jakob Behrman? You know, I mean, Jakob Behrman, I became convinced, having followed his archival trail for a number of years, that he was sincere. He was a believer. He was absolutely selfless that way. He would have given anything at a moment, you know, for this vision. And yet, he oversaw the security apparatus in the bloodiest years of socialist realism. They were torturing people, you know, who had, you know, devoted the past years of their lives to heroically fighting the Nazis in the underground. They were throwing them in prison cells for years. They were executing them. You know, he could not have not known. He was in the Soviet Union during the war. He knew Stalin. He could not have not known. I mean, how then do you make sense of those people? I mean, a part of the drama for me, which I discuss, you know, in this book to some extent, or between the lines, is how do you possibly, you know, kind of approach? I mean, how do you try to understand? And then at what point do you pass judgment or do you not pass judgment? I always had in my mind, as kind of I was writing, I think especially about the communists, there's I don't know how many of you have read Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, and it's this dystopian novel that's told from the point of view of a woman, a handmaid, who is a sexual reproductive slave in this totalitarian dystopian world in which the eyes are always watching. And the last chapter of this novel suddenly shifts to 200 years in the future. And you're suddenly at an academic conference among historians who are sitting around a table, and they have discovered the diary of the handmaid, and they're talking about it. And they're saying things like, well, we have to be cautious about passing moral judgment. We all know that, you know, moral judgment is by nature, you know, culture specific. And they're absolute models of scholarly objectivity and good historical practice. And yet you read that last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale, and it's chilling. You're not empathetic to the historians when you read that last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. And all of the 20 years I've been going back to Eastern Europe, I kept imagining myself. Like, I kept feeling like I'm in that last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. And how do you try to understand without making things okay that can never be made okay? And it's obviously not up to you to do any forgiving. And without being cold. I mean, I find, in some ways that was been from the beginning a kind of impossible moral question for me. That's at the center of trying to tell the stories of those idealists.
We're here for your book. Let me just really say what a fabulous book your husband wrote.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a piece of scholarship that's enlightening about this whole period. Bloodlands.
Bloodlands, yes. Oh.
One more question, and Marek, I think, should.
Yes, to add some further detail to the Behrman riddle. But this one is Adolf Behrman, not Jakob Behrman. As you mentioned, Adolf Behrman emigrated to Israel, and there, of course, he didn't drop any political ambitions. He was a member of Knesset, but what you didn't say is whom he represented in Knesset. It was the Communist Party of Israel that he represented in Knesset. After all those experiences in his life.
No, it's an incredibly interesting story because, yeah, he in some ways he's during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign late 1948, his comrades, his Polish Jewish communist comrades then kind of turn against the left-wing Zionists, their former allies, and they accuse them of bourgeois nationalism and right-wing deviation. And he leaves, and then he goes and joins Mapan, a kind of left-wing Zionist party in Israel. But then in 1952, over the Slansky trial, he refuses to take an anti-Soviet line against the Czechoslovak Communist Party. And so he then breaks with the left-wing Zionist party in Israel and becomes a member of the Knesset representing the Communist Party of Israel. Now, Mark is right. It's a fascinating and ironic chapter.
Well, isn't it perhaps there is an easy explanation that you can have for it, and that explanation comes from Marek Edelman, who considered Adolf Behrman a lightweight.
Mm-hmm.
On that light note, thank you so much.